Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for joining us once again at Convicts and Cops. Today, we will be discussing a California state prison inmate whose claim to fame is encompassed within a 7-year time frame. During that period, this man enjoyed more stabbing punctures on his rotund body than any other inmate behind the prison walls, and he survived. Yes, indeed, today's episode will feature none other than the famous Pincushion Smitty. We will pick up his criminal prison journey in 1965 and follow it until his death in 2004. But before we begin, let's take a quick time out for a word from our sponsor. Coming at you from the book of Psalms, chapter 46 and verse 1. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. I believe it is safe to wonder if the Lord had Pincussion's back during his times of trouble and tribulation. Hey, only our sponsor knows for sure, right? Roger Dale Smith, aka Pincushion Smitty, aka Pincushion Smith, aka RD for Roger Dale, is somewhat of an enigma when it comes to his origins. At different times, Roger Dale, or others, has identified him as hailing from Tennessee, New York, or California. Unfortunately, Pincushion had a loose relationship with the truth, and his truth changed based on his present circumstances and what was best for him. The California Department of Corrections listed his birthday as April 24th, 1947, so that is an accurate beginning. What can be verified with accuracy is Roger Dale Smith's journey through the CDC. On August 23rd, 1965, Pincushion was being held in the San Joaquin jail for attempting to sodomize another young man. He was identified by the press as Roger Dale Smith of Shelbyville, New York, and the paper also stated he went by the alias of David Lee King. Pincushion claimed to be insane, but was declared sane after an examination ordered by San Joaquin County Superior Court Judge Bill Dozier. On October 15, 1965, Pincushion was found guilty of one count of attempted sodomy, and in November he was sentenced to 6 months to 20 years to be served in the California Department of Corrections. On April 30th, 1967, Roger Dale Smith suffered a vicious stabbing assault that earned him the lifetime moniker of Pincushion Smitty. On that fateful day, William Tank Noah, a future Aryan Brotherhood member, Ralph Chicas Chacon from Delano, California, and Maureen's Myers were confined on the same tier as Pincushion in the O-Wing Adjustment Center in Soledad Prison. Shortly after 10 a.m., Tank, Myers, Chacon, and Smith were released from their cells for exercise. The two correctional officers who were on duty, Nance and Fagan, noticed that the 4 inmates formed a group and started a fight, during which Tank, Myers, and Chacon stabbed Smith. The officer shouted to the inmates to stop the fight and return to their cells, but they did not do so and continued stabbing Smith until he played dead and fell to the floor. After this, Tank and Chacon dragged Smith by his legs down the tier to the outside of a cell occupied by future Mexican Mafia member Ernest Garcia from Eloyo Soto. Tank and Chacon proceeded to prop Smith up against Garcia's cell. A knife was passed to Garcia, who then stabbed Smith in the neck, back, and head from inside the cell. Tank, Myers, and Chacon were reported to be wearing stocking caps sporting swastikas during the attack. After tear gas was deployed, the melee broke up. The three assailants moved towards Noah's cell. Noah, Myers, and Chacon threw down their weapons, which were subsequently retrieved by the officers and admitted into evidence. The three men then held a singing session in the cell. Smith later told his counselor that the men were singing the song "You Belong to Me." When the officers arrived, the three inmates were laughing and Noah had a stab wound on his arm. As soon as the men were locked up, Smith got up and walked to the tier gate. Smith was treated on an emergency basis at the hospital for over 50 stab wounds, piercing nearly every organ in his body. It was reported that his heart stopped beating on the operating table twice, but he was revived by medical staff. The way it was told to me by MM member Champ Reynoso was very similar. According to Champ, he was the inmate who was singing "You Belong to Me," a popular oldie but goodie by the Duprees, from his prison cell. Champ was unable to exercise and participate in the attack on Pincushion Smitty, but contributed by drowning out the screams of the victim as he was being attacked by singing loudly. Suspicious officers responded and found the punctured body of inmate Roger Dale Smith, who would from this day forward be known as Pincushion Smitty. Tank, Chacon, Myers, and Garcia were tried for the stabbing assault on Smith. Tank, Chacon, and Myers were found guilty. The jury was unable to reach verdict on the charges against Garcia. The judge declared a mistrial and the charges were dismissed against him. Two psychiatrists examined Tank, Myers, and Chacon and said all three men had spent their adolescence and young manhood behind bars in various institutions. All three were classified as sociopathic, negative, and destructive personalities, but they knew right from wrong and could understand the consequences of their actions. Sadly, this can be said of many of the men that were state raised and became members of the various prison gangs. Tank was prosecuted under Penal Code Section 4500, malicious aggravated assault by a life prisoner, resulting in him being sentenced to death on July 20th, 1967. On November 27th, 1968, the California Supreme Court overturned Tank, Chacon, and Myers' conviction resulting from the Pincushion attack. The court ruled that the judge erred in appointing one attorney to represent all three defendants because each defendant has separate and distinct interests that might be protected but cannot be done so if a single attorney represented all three. Tank was released from death row and shipped back to Soledad for a second trial. Tank and Myers' retrial began on April 2nd, 1969. On April 3rd, 1969, Pincushion took the stand and testified that if he ever had the chance, his intent was to kill all of his assailants, Tank, Chacon, and Myers. As Pincushion stepped away from the witness stand, he grabbed a 36-inch wooden blackboard pointer and threw it in the direction of Tank and Myers, and he shouted obscenities at them. The pair stood up and rushed towards Pincushion. 3 deputies tackled Myers, and 3 others attempted to take down Tank. They had to be joined by 3 Soledad correctional officers who were present inside the courtroom. Pincushion made no move to get involved and just stood there, spitting at the 2 men while laughing and continuing to shout obscenities in their direction. Although Pincushion was rejected by the convict population, he was still a dangerous inmate. During his time on the witness stand testifying versus his assailants, Pincushion's jail cell was being searched. 3 crudely fashioned knives were discovered. 2 were made from metal found inside the air vent, and 1 was fashioned from a sharpened spoon handle. On April 9, 1969, Tank was convicted of aggravated assault by a prisoner serving less than a life sentence. After Pincushion was nearly killed in Soledad's O-Wing, he was transferred to the California Institution for Men. On April 10, 1968, Pincushion attacked Charles Leroy Coleman at the Chino men's prison, who was sitting at a table in the day room of Cypress Hall. Pincushion had 2 shanks, 1 in each hand, made from stolen barber scissors. Coleman was stabbed 5 times, 3 times in the back between the waist and shoulder blade, once in the chest, and once near the right ear. He managed to break away from Pincushion and ran away. The 2 men had apparently exchanged words over the past 4 or 5 days, and Pincushion decided to get off first. Pincushion was charged with attempted murder. He went on pro per status and defended himself with a court-appointed advisor from the Public Defender's Office, but was convicted by a jury on August 12, 1968. On October 6, 1969, the 4th District Court of Appeals reversed the guilty verdict and ordered a new trial due to a ruling that a prejudicial error was committed when Pincushion's second confession to the crime was admitted at trial. Pincushion was being held at the Glen Helen Rehabilitation Center in San Bernardino while awaiting his retrial. On November 21, 1969, Pincushion was housed in San Bernardino at the Glen Helen County facility. Following the evening meal in the E-Block maximum security wing, the cells were left open as they normally are to allow the men to exercise and visit with one another. The men only had access to a long enclosed catwalk and their cells. Pincushion walked by the cell of 26-year-old James Stanley Canine, who grabbed Pincushion by the collar of his overalls and said, "Come here, you pretty bitch. I want to kiss you." Pincushion pushed him away and returned to his cell and developed a plan to kill Canine. Once he had his plan in place, he tore some strips from his bedsheet and walked back over to Canine's cell and bet him a bag of tobacco he could tie him up and he would be unable to get free. Canine agreed. Pincushion tied him up loosely on purpose so that Canine could free himself. As planned, Canine was able to get free. Pincushion then bet Canine he could tie him up again and he would be unable to get out. He also sweetened the bet by offering 3 bags of tobacco this time. Canine agreed. Pincushion tied Canine up well, then knelt and strangled him with a piece of torn bedsheet. Once he was dead, Pincushion covered him with a sheet and a blanket, grabbed the first bag of tobacco he lost, spit on the dead man, and walked out of the cell. In addition to a retrial for attempted murder for the stabbing at Chino, now there were murder charges he would answer for. The retrial got underway first. On July 17, 1970, after a court appearance, Pincushion was taken from a holding cell and was being led by deputies to the main part of the jail, where shackles would be placed on him when he said, "Just a minute." Pincushion set down a large cardboard box containing his legal files on the floor. Then he spun around holding what appeared to be a revolver in his hand and told the 3 deputies to freeze. Pincushion then started to run into the booking room of the jail. A deputy asked him for the gun. Pincushion laughed and surrendered the gun he had fashioned out of soap, paper clips, and blackened with ink. On August 27, 1970, at 10:30 a.m., jury deliberations got underway. On August 28, 1970, at 2:30 p.m., the jury returned a guilty verdict on one count of attempted voluntary manslaughter for the Chino stabbing. 7.5 years were added to the current term he was serving. Next up for Pincushion was the murder trial for the strangulation death of James Stanley Canine in the Glen Helen facility. In pre-trial motions, Pincushion announced plans to call up to 70 convicts from death row and the various lockup units throughout the state. This came after the infamous Marin County courthouse takeover and the bloodbath that ensued. This produced concerns in San Bernardino. On September 3, 1970, San Bernardino County Superior Court Judge James E. Cunningham ordered CDC to transport Pincushion to every prison in the state to interview prospective witnesses. On the list of witnesses was George Jackson, a BGF member awaiting trial for murder, Clifford Jefferson, also known as Death Row Jeff. This probably played a part in motivating the judge to make such an unorthodox court ruling. Pincushion was transported on a prison bus from Chino to San Quentin, CMF Vacaville, Folsom, DVI, CMC at San Luis Obispo, and then back to Chino. On October 16, 1970, Pincushion was found guilty of first-degree murder. The only evidence presented was a videotaped confession and a reenactment by Pincushion himself. He probably knew this was coming. One day prior to being found guilty, Pincushion attacked Officer G.B. Green while preparing to shower. Green sustained a cut ear and broken kneecap. The Sanity trial got underway on October 19, 1970. The judge asked Pincushion if he would sit through the Sanity trial and give assurances that he would not be disruptive. He failed to answer the judge, who ordered the bailiffs to bring in the jury. Pincushion stood up, wearing leg shackles, a waist chain, and handcuffs attached to his waist chain. He kicked a chair and began cussing out the judge. 2 deputies and a bailiff came up behind him, and Pincushion spat at the judge. The 3 men wrestled with him until Pincushion fell to the floor. The men then picked him up and carried him out of the courtroom while he continued to spit at the judge. On October 29, 1970, the jury decided that Pincushion was sane. On November 3, 1970, the jury handed down a death sentence. Pincushion was formally sentenced to death on December 24, 1970, by Superior Court Judge Cunningham. Death row is where Pincushion Smitty and Charles Manson first met. They only exercised with each other, trusting no other prisoner since they both knew they were targets for execution. Pincushion and Manson formed a relationship that would last until one of them passed away. The nature of that relationship has produced some interesting speculation. Some say Pincushion was using Manson. Apparently, they had their fair share of disagreements, but they always made up and continued their association with each other. On February 18, 1972, the California Supreme Court ruled that the state death penalty was unconstitutional and ordered the sentences of the 107 men on death row commuted or reduced to life with the possibility of parole. Pincushion Smitty and Charlie Manson were bounced around between the Adjustment Center and B section at San Quentin Prison before both ended up in Vacaville. At Vacaville, the doctors of the Lister program took their turn trying to control Pincussion's behavior. The Lister program was also known as the Maximum Psychiatric Diagnostic Unit. The initial aim of the program was to perform brain surgery on violent prisoners. Due to the public outcry, the Council on Criminal Justice rejected the appropriation of funds, and the Department of Corrections canceled plans to carry out the lobotomies. Another controversial treatment that was employed in the Lister program was the use of the drug anectine in experimental punishment aversion therapy. After being injected with anectine, the prisoner experienced paralysis of all his voluntary muscles for about 60 seconds. One of the psychiatrists said, "It is as though you are suffocating or drowning." This produces a deep feeling of horror and terror, making the sensation seem lengthier. During this state, it was believed that the subject was highly susceptible to suggestions. At this point, the therapist would tell the subject that the next time he had a violent impulse, he would stop, think, and remember the sensation he felt developing an aversion for violence. Pincushion was a recipient of this treatment, but it failed. He was shipped back to the San Quentin Adjustment Center. As always, the Adjustment Center was plagued by violence. On June 2nd, 1974, Pincushion and William A. Tidwell, Jr., convicted of murder, engaged in a fistfight in the Adjustment Center yard. Guards fired a warning shot, breaking up the fight. No weapons were used, so no injuries were reported. However, Pincushion wouldn't be so lucky next time. Prior to Pincushion's next incident, there was an inmate from El Paso, Texas. His name was Frankie Padilla, also known as Kiko from EPT. Apparently, word had gotten around that he had been stabbed many times during his tenure as a convicted felon. So I remember the day that Kiko was stabbed coming out of the South Block Rotunda onto the upper yard. We received word that Mexican Mafia member Gabby Baeza had hit him enough times to make Kiko the real Pincushion. He had surpassed Pincushion Smitty by one stab wound as the number one inmate with the most stabbing punctures. When word got back to Pincushion about this development, you could see that he was visibly shaken and appeared somewhat depressed. On August 26, 1974, Pincushion was stabbed twice at 1:20 p.m. in his adjustment center cell. He suffered a punctured lung from 2 stab wounds in his left back and cuts on his left shoulder and head. Pincushion survived his wounds, but was reported in critical condition. A suspect was identified. I remember him only as Paddlefoot, an African-American inmate who was, like Pincushion, on PC status, protective custody. A 9-inch heavy gauge wire sharpened to a point was found. However, prison officials did not know how the suspect was able to get into Pincushion's cell to stab him. All men in the adjustment center were single-celled. Rumor had it that Pincushion allowed himself to be stabbed to reclaim the title of most stab wounds received. Yet, it almost cost him his life. Talk about sick guys. Sometime after this incident, I recall how Pincushion was basking in the glory of being the number one Pincushion. Having already been fully briefed on the Soledad incident where he had previously been stabbed, I decided to have some fun and rub a little salt into the wounds. Pincushion was making the rounds, passing out tooth powder. As he approached my cell, I began to sing the song he now loathed with a passion. My rendition of "You Belong to Me" must have hit him hard because he stormed off the floor, visibly upset, and refused to complete his assignment. I don't remember ever again seeing Pincushion Smitty. During Pincushion's tenure as an inmate in the San Quentin Adjustment Center, his case was assigned to prison counselor Edward George. George would later author a book about Charles Manson. Because Manson and Pincushion had a long-standing relationship, some of Pincushion's exploits were touched upon. Here are some examples. One day, George was in the adjustment center when news circulated in the building among officers and staff that an inmate was lying butt naked and sunbathing on the yard. George had to see it to believe it. Sure enough, when he peered out the window onto the exercise yard, there was Pincushion, naked as a jaybird. He was lying completely naked on a towel in the middle of the yard, in an obviously aroused condition, reading a Playboy magazine and attempting to seduce another young PC inmate. George yelled at him, asking, "What the hell are you doing?" Pincushion casually glanced away from the Playboy magazine and innocently replied, "Just getting a little sunshine, boss." George told him to get dressed or he was going to lock him up. Pincushion got up slowly, as if he was offended, and said, "It's no big deal, boss. I'm so white from all that cell time, I need a little tan." He put on his underwear nevertheless, and pants, but left his shirt off, asking, "Is this okay, boss?" A few days after this incident, George was in his office, bent over his desk, focused on procedures for the new Adjustment Center manual, when he was startled by a shadow. He looked around and saw Pincushion in the doorway with a strange, wanton look on his face. He said to George, "You sure have a nice ass, boss. I'd sure like to bust your brownie." George was angered by the lewd remark and replied, "What?" Pincushion clarified his statement and said, "I mean, I'd like to butt F you," jerking his hips forward to emphasize the point. George glared back at Pincushion and said, "Over my dead body." They both started laughing once he said this, because Pincushion was committed to CDC for a sexual crime. He had killed for sex, and sex was his main motivating factor. Therefore, the "over my dead body" remark was the wrong thing to say to a man like Pincushion. He told George, "The moment you said that, I thought, I've killed for a lot less, and I knew you knew it." In 1975, the adult authorities set Pincushion's term for the murder he committed in the Glen Helen jail at 10 years. Due to a bookkeeping error, Pincushion was almost released in 1978, but his parole date was recalculated and set for 1983. Although that date was not etched in stone, the Community Release Board, which had by now replaced the adult authority in 1977 when the determinate sentencing law went into effect, did not believe Pincushion should even be released in 1983 and directed San Quentin administrators to notify them of any new disciplinary infractions committed by Pincushion. I'm sure you all want to know if Pincushion ever made it out to Broadway. The answer is a resounding negative. They were not gonna let this zip-damn fool out anytime soon. Receiving one parole denial after another, he was destined to spend the rest of his life behind the walls. In 1996, he was reunited with Manson at Corcoran's PHU, Protective Housing Unit. Other high-profile PC cases housed inside this unit with Pincushion Smitty were Sirhan Sirhan, the man who assassinated Robert F. Kennedy in 1968, Juan Corona, a mass murderer who killed and buried 25 migrant workers in 1971 in Yuba City, and former Aryan Brotherhood member Michael Thompson. Pincushion resumed his role as Manson's secretary and assisted him with his mail. The end came for Pincushion not in the form of a bone crusher, but from cancer. In February 2004, Pincushion passed away just short of his 57th birthday after spending 39 years locked up. But Pincushion's name would ring out once again in 2017 when Manson died. There was a dispute over who was the rightful heir to Manson's estate, When the will was examined, there in black and white was Pincussion's signature. He had served as Manson's witness when his will was written. Prison is full of twisted individuals like Pincushion, plotting and scheming to get over unsuspecting inmates so they can claim their property, manhood, even their life. Consider this very carefully before getting involved in activities that will lead you to a life behind the walls. Until the next episode, good night and God bless you.